A very warm welcome. You're watching a special show, Global Chit Chat on Oneindia English, where we discuss the critical international issues. And we're joined by a foreign policy expert, Mr. Tridivesh Singh Maini. Thanks a lot for joining us, sir.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So, sir, as we see the current economic situation in Iran, what exactly do you think are the reasons behind that situation currently?
Okay. So first of all, just a bit of a background that, if you look at the current situation and you look at, the growth rates over the past 3 years, if you look at inflation, that will give you an idea of the state of the economy. So after the withdrawal of the US, from the JCPOA, when the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, Iran has, basically witnessed 2 consecutive years of negative growth. And 2021, it is being estimated that Iran may grow at 1.5%. So, and you can compare this to 2016, when, because in 2015, Iran had signed the JCPOA. So immediately after that, 2016, Iran actually grew at 12%. Now that may give us a slightly wrong picture, but the Iranian economy obviously was in a much better shape, before the US withdrawal from JCPOA. Now what is happening? As I said, consecutive years of negative growth. Now we're growing at 1.5%. Inflation is rising, and inflation for 2 years. If you look at the years 2018, 19, 2019, 20, it has been basically consecutively rising over 30%. And now this year also it's estimated that the inflation rate, in fact, has gone over 40%. Now, if you look at specific food commodities, if you look at milk, if you look at eggs, there the inflation is even higher. The prices have gone up even more. 70%, 80 in the urban area, 70%, 80%. Now, naturally, this is creating a lot of problems. Add to this, everything is linked. So if you have such deep-rooted economic problems, then last month, in the month of June, you had protests by livestock farmers because they were saying that, the cost of animal feed has increased. Recently, you've been having protests because of the water shortages. So there are the economy, anybody who takes over, it's an onerous responsibility to, put the economy back on track. It's going to be a major challenge. And the incoming president, obviously, from whatever, news reports, articles, and everything, he's probably understands this. So the situation is, it's going to take something actually to put the Iranian economy back on track. You can say that, you can divide this into two. The first is obviously, US sanctions. Because what has happened is that automatically, Iran depends a lot on its exports of oil, for generation of revenues and all that. So obviously that has taken a hit. Then you had the COVID-19. And COVID-19 has taken a lot of lives. And what also worsened the situation was that even during COVID-19, the Trump administration did not really give any relaxation of sanctions per se. So that was, one more. So basically, as it is, there were problems because of US sanctions and this COVID-19 situation. This made things even worse. And even recently, in fact, Iran was in lockdown. So this is the second part of it. And then, of course, if you look at the domestic situation, if you look at the handling, the economic handling, naturally, each government basically looks for a short-term reprieve. Then you have populist policies. Now you have to balance out. On the one hand, you have to you can't suddenly, if you have welfare schemes, if you have populism is globally, if you look at it, it's not just one country. Globally, you have populism. Now you have to somehow or the other ensure that if you made promises, and in such a situation where there's a crisis, with a deep crisis, obviously, you also raise the level of populism is also much higher. So now you have to finance that. Now, obviously, you're not generating revenues. So it's a mix of a number of factors.
Well, yes, all the reasons are there, but at this point of time, what do you think could be the solution to Iran's economic issues?
Okay, so obviously it's a long haul. It's, as I said, it's easier said than done. If you look at the current situation, even if hypothetically, even if Iran and the US were to reach some agreement, it's not just overnight things are not going to get sorted out. But what economists have advised the incoming president is that the first part is that he should not be too dogmatic about his economics. He should have advisors from different who have different economic ideologies. So you don't necessarily need to have either only people on the right or on the left. You need a mix. You actually need a mixed economy. And that is not just the case of Iran, but globally, when you look at it, people make promises when they're out of, when they're in campaign mode, they may be either extreme right, they may be extreme left, but you have to balance the two. And if you look at the Iranian economy, the need for a mixed economy, mixed approach is even more. So you need to have advisors, and you don't need to go by your, some of the advisors who have been mentioned so far are a bit more isolationist. So Iran can also not afford. You need people who are a bit more, who are globally acceptable. Obviously there have been problems between Iran and the West, and again, resolving issues between multilateral institutions and Iran, you cannot solve them overnight. There are deep-rooted issues over the last few years. But still, if you have somebody with credibility who's a more acceptable face, that also matters. So in important portfolios, important advisors, they need to be savvy, they need to be acceptable, at least to some extent, globally as well. And you need people from different, as I said, you need a mixed economy sort of approach. So you need advisors who are pragmatic and who are not too dogmatic about any particular ideology. So far, if you look at the vision of the incoming president, there has been more of an emphasis on populism. There is no real, as far as revenue generation is concerned, so obviously some parts are perfectly valid. So for instance, he's spoken about providing healthcare. He's spoken about housing projects, and he's spoken about focusing on the bottom of the pyramid. But so far, what has happened even in Iran is a lot of the subsidies which are there, they have actually benefited the upper crust. For instance, in things like electricity and all, the upper crust of society has benefited more. Those who actually need support, who need hand-holding, are not getting it. So obviously, these subsidies need to be more sort of well-targeted. Beyond the advisors of the incoming president and his views and how he deals with it, obviously, the other thing is that you need, Iran and the US somehow need to find an understanding whereby, the US gets on board JCPOA. The sanctions which are there against Iran are sort of removed. Some progress had been made earlier in June. In fact, some names had been removed. Some companies, some individuals had been removed from the sanctions list. US had even said that it would go further. Specifically 3 sectors they would remove the subsidies, but that hasn't happened so far. In fact, there is news that, again, from certain media reports that the US is getting a bit impatient about the negotiations. So probably we can take that up later.
So, well, what do you think are exactly the geopolitical angles to Iran's economic situation?
Okay, so the first point is obviously about how is the US ready to be patient with the new leadership? Because there is talk about the incoming president actually saying that, these Vienna negotiations, everything, they're good, but I want to start from scratch. Now, if that happens, because as it is, if you look at his posturing in the election campaign and all, Raisi has taken a very anti sort of Western stance, especially specifically the US. He's not been that anti-China, but he's been anti-US and the West. So obviously he would, for his credibility, he would like to show that, he's negotiated a good deal. Now, and he would not like to yield an inch. And as you would know that in the last few months, Iran has also violated certain, if you look at the JCPOA, it's not at this point of time, especially the last 2 months, if you look at some of the provisions, they've been violated by Iran, and the US and EU countries have expressed their displeasure with Iran and said, this model. So how is the US going to react to that? Now, there is talk that if the US also, even if this administration, they lose patience, they may just, for instance, impose sanctions on China for on its oil imports from Iran. So if steps like that are taken again, to sort of push Iran to the wall, I think that is going to be problematic. So ultimately, the Iran-US relationship, they need both sides to find a middle path. That's very important for Iran's economy, for the relationship, and more also for the US should not lose sight of the fact that if it again pushes Iran to the wall like the Trump administration, then you're going to see Iran moving closer to China. Clearly has an option. I mean, as we've discussed on earlier programs, also yet this 25-year agreement is already there, and China, seeing the regional situation, in any case wants to sort of warm up further, cozy up further to Iran. So that is an important aspect which the US should not lose sight of. As far as China is concerned, I mean, either way, it's good. If the sanctions are removed, China can actually deepen its economic linkages with Iran. Because while again, publicly China may say that it may speak against the US, but obviously it cannot totally be in contravention of the provisions of these sanctions. It cannot go against them. So that's one part of it. And on the other hand, if Iran is left with no option and they actually veer towards China, that also suits China because in terms of regional connectivity, in terms of strengthening economic linkages, so that part is there. And then you have other countries. I mean, if you look beyond the US, if you look beyond China, you also have other countries like, so for instance, US allies. I mean, and obviously even India also has. While ties had soured after 2019 when it stopped purchasing oil from Iran, but since in the end of 2019, and then in recent months, after the Biden administration came into power in January 2021, since then India has actually been paying more attention to the Chabahar project. And one more thing which needs to be borne into mind, that I think now India also is ready to some extent to not, because after 2019, when it totally towed the US line, there were problems and the Iranians also weren't too happy. So possibly, the US may just give some space to India. So like earlier in 2019, they had exempted the Chabahar port. Chabahar port was exempted, was not part of the sanctions, right? So similarly, now also they may give some space to India, but it depends also upon how, whether India is ready to actually sort of take on the US and, send out this clear message. And then, of course, you have other Western countries also who realize that, they obviously, on the one hand, they have economic interests, and they also realize that they don't want to isolate Iran and push it to a corner. So I think if you look at the sum and substance of it, there's one very strong domestic component which we have discussed in terms of economics and all. I think Iran also needs to dispel this notion that it's becoming more isolationist. Because especially if you look at, it's not Hassan Rouhani or it's not the Iranian foreign minister, but if the supreme religious leader, he's made some statements which were anti-West last year. And as far as Raisi is concerned, it's too early to comment because I think there is, he's quite pragmatic on certain issues. He's not really spoken, for instance, against the deal per se. But it's very important for Iran to shed this isolationist image because it's not only about ties with the US, it's about ties even with other countries. So that's one thing. And only if you shed that, then you can get foreign direct investment. Then, because if you are, let's say you reach some sort of agreement, and otherwise you're broadly isolationist, you have suspicion of the West, the other side is suspicious of you, you really can't, I mean, there's not going to be much economic progress per se. And all this does is, I mean, so what happens is that all the frustration, which is actually, the Iranian public, it comes out against the political class there as well, but it comes out even against the West, because the political class then sends out the whole message that, it's not because of us. So they get a free pass as far as their governance failures are concerned. And I mean, to some extent, it's true as well. I mean, it's largely true that the pressure because of the sanctions and all has created these problems. So I think it's the US in the past has made these mistakes. They don't understand the domestic politics, giving space to leaders. The Biden administration of late, in the past few weeks, even on the Iran issue, they seem to be, not, I won't say that it's exactly the Trump administration, but they shouldn't make the same mistake in terms of, putting this, what the Trump administration called the maximum pressure policy on Iran. That's going to be counterproductive.
True. Thanks a lot for joining us, sir. I hope that our discussion was fruitful for all the viewers, and it will be interesting to look at how Iran battles its current economic situation. We'll be back next week with another episode of Global Chit Chat.